I've never really shared this story before, mainly because it still causes me mental distress every time I think about it, even all of these years later. But after reading a bunch of other stories posted in this group and seeing that a lot of people have gone through terrible things, some of them even similar to mine, I decided that I should put this out there and see if it helps me get past it. Maybe it'll help others see the severity of obsessive behavior, and if it helps anyone, then that would be an added bonus in my mind. Back whenever I was in high school, there was this kid named Carter, who was always a bit odd and out there. He was quiet. Very quiet. He kept to himself for the most part, but he had a bit of a fascination with me. In that, where he never really spoke to anyone else, he always treated me like I was a good friend. Like we had talked all the time. Now, I didn't mind Carter. He seemed like an okay person, but outside of that, I never really paid much attention to him, assuming that he was just shy or that he might have had a bit of a crush on me or something. I figured it was completely harmless, that it would pass, and that would be that. However, of course, that's not how things went. What started as him having just that small crush turned into him getting a bit creepy. He started seeming to always be around, seemingly by coincidence. He would be in the hallways nearby when I walked to class. At lunch, he would sit at the table next to where I was, regardless of who else was sitting there, or he would stand with his back against the wall near the table if there were people already there. He joined the drama club randomly, and would be there every day after school when the meetings would occur. I tried to pretend that it had nothing to do with me, that I was just noticing a bunch of coincidental occurrences, and that he wasn't doing it to be around me. Then, the notes started. There was a random note in my locker one day, handwritten and not signed, and it was filled with a bunch of compliments and declarations of love. Flattering, sure, but it was cringe-inducing too. It had compliments about random things that really didn't make sense to me, like the straightness of my teeth and how I walked. And, of course, that wasn't the only one. Oh no. It happened every day for a few days. And then there were a few days where there were multiples, and it started getting beyond unsettling. They started mentioning details about my life that no one should have known. One specifically mentioned the color of the underwear that I was wearing that day, and how it matched the color of my bed covers. Worse yet, it was actually accurate. When I read that, I started to feel sick to my stomach, realizing that this guy was stalking me. I could no longer pretend that it was all a coincidence. I had to accept and address that this boy was pushing boundaries. I will say that I was only 16 and I really didn't know what to do about it beyond telling an adult. And I figured that I should tell my school counselor since it technically was happening at school. So I went to my counselor and I explained everything that was going on, and I gave her those notes, including the last ones that I mentioned. She read them, and after getting through it and taking a few moments to think about it, she looked at me and said, "And you think you know who sent these?" I told her that it was Carter, and she asked me how I knew for sure. I tried to explain that he had been stalking me, that he was always around and such, but she mentioned that none of the letters were signed, and that I couldn't just accuse him without being able to prove it. I asked how I was supposed to prove it, and she shrugged me off, saying that, as serious as this sounded, there was nothing to show that it was actually him, and that I should talk to him about it. She seriously recommended that I talk to him about this whole thing. That I talk to him about how obsessive he was, about the fact that he had obviously been peeping in my window at some point. That was not going to happen, obviously. I walked out of that room and I finished the day, and when I got home, I just went and laid down in my bed and sobbed. I was feeling paranoid, freaked out, like he was watching me while I was sitting there crying. I kept glancing out my window thinking that I would see him, thinking he would be right there for some reason. When my dad got home, he asked me what was going on, and I explained the whole thing to him, and I even told him that I tried to talk to my school counselor, and that she basically told me she couldn't do anything about it. He was shocked and angry, and when I told him about the counselor and he read the part about how the guy was looking in my window, he became furious. He told me that he was going to talk to the counselor that next morning. The next day, he drove me to school and went in to talk to her, and when he came out, it was pretty clear that everyone was unhappy. He told me that I was going to be staying home from school that day, and we left. When we got home, he told me some of what was said, and he mentioned that the counselor was going to have a conversation with Carter, and then said that things would be okay. The day when I went back, the next day, I was nervous that I was going to run into Carter in the hallways. But from what I could tell, he wasn't at the school, which made me feel a bit better. That is, until I got home. When I got home from school, as was normal, my parents weren't home yet. I went in and grabbed something to eat and then sat in the living room to watch something on TV. After about 20 minutes, I heard something in the garage, like something had fallen down, and without even thinking, I got up to see what exactly it was. When I opened the door, my heart dropped. There, in the middle of the garage, was Carter, just standing there trying to pick up what he had knocked down. He looked up at me and gave me this horrible grin, and then immediately started toward the door. Thankfully, there were two things that were going to be my saving grace. The door upstairs from the garage had a deadbolt lock on it, and my dad was going to be home within only a couple of minutes. I slammed the door and locked it, with the deadbolt and the knob lock. After a couple of minutes, I could hear Carter smacking the door and yelling at me, telling me that I needed to let him in, that he loved me, and that I needed to let him be close to me. With the door locked, there was only one way out of the garage, and that was through the garage door, which was now opening because my dad was pulling in. I heard my dad pull into the garage, I heard the door open, and I heard my dad shouting at Carter, yelling at him to get on the ground, and Carter saying that he wasn't there to do anything wrong. That may have been believable had he not somehow broken into the garage to wait for me to get home. A bit after this, my dad told me to call the police and tell them that Carter had broken into our home, and, long story short, the police did show up. I explained what had happened, that I'd come home and found him in the garage. After a lot of talking to the cops and then putting Carter into the back of the car, I was just sitting there staring at him in the back of the police car as they asked us questions and got more info. They pulled off, and I had never been happier than that day. Thankfully, that was pretty much the end of it. I don't know how far into the legal system Carter ended up getting, but I never saw him at school again. Obviously, I never got another note in my locker either. I never had to deal with his craziness again, and my life got back on track almost immediately. I'm thankful that my dad took me seriously, and screw that counselor for not even thinking to address the whole thing beyond saying, "Oh, we can't prove it." Oh, and Carter, I'm glad that you and I never met again. And please, stay the hell away from me.